A Shot in the Dark by Silverpup. Chapter 24. The mithril shirt was just as light and cool as Bilbo remembered it to be. It fell to his thighs and past his elbows, but left his collarbone and neck wide open, along with his legs and arms. When he stood before Tauriel to show her this, she slowly took in every inch of skin that was visible to her in the morning light. "I believe I have made enough, and what I lack can be easily fixed," she said, with one arm crossed over her chest, while the other tapped out an unknown melody against her chin. "I may have to adjust a few places, too." Bilbo shrugged one shoulder. "As you wish. May I see what you have made so far?" The elf nodded and squatted down to the swathed bundle that she had brought along. When she opened it, he saw several pieces of light brown leather that were sewed together with meticulous little brown stitches. Most of the pieces looked incomplete to his eyes, but he couldn't be sure. It wasn't as if he knew anything about armor. "The first I made were these greaves to protect your legs," Tauriel explained, holding up the two longest pieces of leather with brown laces at the edges. "I will tie them for you, but you must tell me if they're too tight." He nodded and held still as the elf slid the smooth leather around one of his legs. It came up just past his knee and ended nearly to his ankles. The rough edges tickled his feet, but it covered his tendon well enough, so he ignored it. When he gave her a nod, Tauriel easily and quickly laced it up on the side and looked up at him with her brows raised. "How does it feel?" The hobbit lifted his leg, tested the weight, and then bent it before he gave her a nod. "Perfect! It's not too heavy and I can still move easily enough." The elf flashed him a quick smile before setting her attention on the second greave. "Perfect. Let's try the other one now." Once both greaves were laced up and secured, the warrior moved on and pulled out an oddly shaped piece of leather. It was the same color as the greaves, but was shaped as a triangle with smooth edges and the same bit of lacing at one end. When he asked what it was, the captain explained. "This is a gorget," she said, wrapping the piece around his neck. "It will protect your neck and collarbone." "It feels like a noose," Bilbo complained, tugging at the top where it dug into his jaw and chin. Tauriel rolled her eyes and pulled his hand away. "You'll be thankful for it later when it saves you from an arrow to the neck. Now stop wiggling and let me tie this." He sniffed, but held still for the elf. Once it was properly laced up, it found that it did indeed cover most of his neck and a good portion of his upper chest. The leather was just as smooth and warm as the other two, and protected him well enough. He still hated it, though, as it kept pushing up into his jaw. The final piece of armor the elf presented to him was a simple pair of fingerless gauntlets. The leather was soft and well used, and covered his entire forearm. It snugly embraced his hands and arms when he flexed them. "Well now, take a look at you. You look like an actual warrior," the captain praised, settling her hands on her slight hips. Bilbo looked down at himself and snorted. "I looked like I allowed a blind man to dress me. Nothing matches." "Really? I was thinking you looked more like you allowed a child to dress you," the elf commented, winking at him. He made a face at her that earned him a windchime laugh in response. "Put your shirt and pants on and it will look better," she advised him, tossing her long hair over one shoulder. The hobbit did as ordered and found that in the end he did no longer look as ridiculous as before. When he pulled on his frayed and ripped red coat, Tauriel made a noise in her throat that drew his attention back to her. "That coat, the color will draw a great deal of attention," she pointed out with a frown that made the fine bones of her face even more prominent. He shrugged and began to roll up the sleeves to his elbows. "I'm aware of that. But Dory made it for me when he found out I lost my old one, so..." Tauriel's face softened and her eyes lightened. "I see." Bilbo reached down and picked up his sash and tied it tightly around his waist so his coat would not flap open when he moved. Then he buckled his belt and settled Sting against his hip and tugged a pouch away into his coat. Finally, he pulled on his whistle from bow fur and looked up to the elven warrior. "Well, do I look acceptable now?" he asked, holding his arms out and turning in a circle. Tauriel tapped her chin with 2 fingers and slowly looked him up and down with her starlight eyes. "Better than before. We can now be seen together by others." He rolled his eyes and dropped his arms. "You're so generous." I think Bilbo found himself cut off as a loud horn echoed through the camp. Tauriel's face immediately became hard as her brows furrowed and her jaw clenched while her hand went to the hilt of her blade in a blink. She looked off to the east side of the camp and slowly narrowed her hazel eyes. "That was a warning from the scouts. Azog and his army are coming," she said, her eyes never blinking. The hobbit felt a trickle of fear wind its way down his back. "What? But I thought they wouldn't get here until noon." We were wrong, Taddeo replied as she stalked off to the other side of the camp. Bilbo quickly followed after her, struggling to keep up with her long legs and greater stride. Where are we going? He asked the elf. To my king. He will be directing the soldiers into their squads, the captain replied without looking at him. Bilbo nodded and followed Taddeo as she led him through the many tents and moving elves until they finally found Thranduil's tent. The king stood in front of it, dressed in the silver and gold armor, with his smooth hair held back by a thin band of mithril. At his hips was a long and elegant sword that was nearly as tall as the hobbit. The sight of the king dressed for battle made Bilbo stop and stare. He had forgotten over the many years exactly how deadly the elven king really was under his acid words and porcelain face. Taddeo, Thranduil acknowledged with a small nod as he laced his fingers behind his back. The battle is finally upon us. Taddeo dropped to one knee and placed a hand against her chest, over her heart. Direct me, my liege. Gather your troops and get into position, the elf ordered in Sindarian, his silver eyes never wavering, even as another horn boomed through the camp. You know your orders. Do not fail me. Taddeo nodded once before standing up straight and marching away, but the elf gone, the king finally turned his eyes to the hobbit standing off to the side. You plan to participate in the battle, Thranduil commented, one of his dark brows rising slightly. He nodded and crossed his arms over his chest. I do. My friends are out there, and I will not leave them to fight alone. Gandalf asked me to keep you behind so you would be safe, the elf said as he slowly looked the burglar over. But I do not believe that is possible for anyone. No, I will fight in this battle, whether Gandalf wants me to or not, he replied, raising his chin stubbornly. Thranduil's lips twitched at one corner as he nodded his head once. Go then, halfling. Go protect your foolish dwarves. Maybe this time they'll accept your help. My name is Bilbo, he reminded the elf with a scowl before turning on his heel and marching away from the battle. After much thought and deliberation, Bilbo reluctantly came to the decision to wear the ring from the beginning of the battle. He didn't like the idea, but he could find no other solution. He was a small and slight hobbit, going into battle with elves and men who had no loyalty to him. His only friends and comrades were Beorn, Taddeo, and Bard, and he didn't even know where they were. If he wanted to survive long enough to save his friends, then he knew he would need an advantage over the orcs and goblins. The ring was the only advantage that he could think of. This means nothing, he warned as he slipped the ring into his front pocket. You will not tempt me again. I won't allow it. The ring simply cackled. Promises, promises. Ahead of him, Bilbo could see the elves and men moving into position to box the enemy between them and the dwarves. Gandalf had played mediator between the two sects and had managed to convince Dain and Thorin to keep their dwarves stationed before Erebor to meet the orcs and goblins head-on. Meanwhile, the elves and men would wait until the enemy was completely between them before they would move and begin to take out the rear end of Azog's army. It was a practical plan, but he hated it, as it meant his dwarves would be facing the brunt of the orcs and goblins alone for a time. As the men and elves continued to gather, Bilbo looked around until he spotted a watchtower. Carefully and slowly, he began to climb it until he could see over the heads of the elves and men and into the distance beyond. What he saw made his stomach roll and his mouth turn dry. Thousands and thousands of orcs and wargs and goblins were marching towards Erebor with Azog in the lead. The black and brown mess of bodies looked like a blight on the land to him. Ahead of the army, he could see the newly constructed gates of Erebor closed with rows and rows of dwarven warriors before it. There was a great deal of them, and they all stood perfectly still and armed as Azog's army marched closer and closer to them. But as brave and ready as the dwarves stood, Bilbo still felt himself shiver when he noticed how much bigger Azog's army was compared to them. I have to get to them, he thought fiercely as he slowly began to climb down the watchtower. The moment his feet touched the scorched earth, he began to jog towards the dwarven city. He didn't get very far, though, as a hand suddenly grabbed him by the back of his coat and stopped him. Whoa! Where do you think you're going? Asked Beorn as he held the hobbit up with one hand and looked him over. Bilbo scowled and tried to kick the giant, holding him up like some troublesome kitten. Beorn, put me down! I'm going to help my friends! Beorn's dark brows met his hairline. What? Are you crazy? You'll be slaughtered before you even get within 12 feet of them. I will not, he denied, still trying and failing to kick the shapeshifter in the chest as he was held farther away. I have a plan! Now put me down! Not happening. You're going to get yourself killed with such stupidity. The giant pointed out, shaking him slightly. Beorn, my friends are out there, he yelled, pointing to where Erebor sat. I cannot leave them there to fight alone. They need my help. Beorn's face softened, but he still did not release Bilbo. You are alone and tiny bunny. What difference can you make? Bilbo laughed a high and unpleasant laugh. To the world, absolutely nothing. To a single dwarf, everything. I would give my life freely if it means the ones that I love can live to see tomorrow. Put him down, Master Beorn, ordered Tauriel as she came sauntering up to them in dark leather armor. She had tied her hair back in one long braid and had her blades and bow prepped and ready to go. She stopped next to the shapeshifter and placed one hand on her hip and pointed to the ground with the other. Now, she said simply, staring up at the giant with flashing eyes. Beorn huffed, but gently settled the hobbit back down on the ground. Bilbo roughly pulled himself away and stepped back to fix his coat again. Did you hear what he plans to do? Beorn asked the elf, staring down at her with a scowl and scrunched brows. Yes, he is planning to go and help his friends, the elf replied calmly as she settled her other hand on her hip. And you're fine with that? You're just going to allow him to go gallivanting off, to be killed? The shapeshifter pressed, pulling his mouth back in a small snarl that revealed the sharp points of his canines. Looming over the slender elf, Bilbo was suddenly very aware of how much larger Beorn was compared to her. Tauriel did not flinch or back down. He won't be killed, because we are going with him. Beorn blinked. What? Bilbo parroted back. You heard me. You and I will be accompanying Master Baggins into battle, she explained simply. Well, what about your troops? Bilbo asked, gesturing to where the elves and men were gathering. Don't they need you to lead them? I've given them their orders and left them with Legolas. They will be fine under his command, the captain replied, shrugging her lean shoulders. You really mean it? You want us to go into battle with him? Beorn questioned, rubbing his beard as he visibly considered the offer. Tauriel nodded. Yes, I've been considering it since yesterday, when he affirmed he would be entering the battle. Seeing what we're up against now, I realize that I cannot allow him to go without protection. It would be unethical of me. Beorn nodded. You're right. He's so small that he would get squished within minutes. I wouldn't sleep right tonight, knowing that I allowed that to happen. Don't I get a say in this? Bilbo wondered out loud with a hint of a whine in his voice. No, the two replied in unison. Another horn was blown in the distance, a deep and booming sound that resonated into his bones. The hobbit recognized it as a dwarven horn and then immediately heard the war cries of the dwarves follow, echoing from Erebor and into their camp. Azog's army had reached them and the battle of the five armies had begun. If you two are coming, then we need to leave now, he said sharply, looking up to the taller duo. They both nodded, their expressions serious and determined, even as another horn tore through the air. Beyond them, he could hear Bard yelling out orders to his men while Legolas spoke in a calmer voice to his soldiers. The elves and men were getting ready to split up and move into position. We are with you, Master Baggins, Tauriel promised, her hazel flashing gold in the morning light. Until the end. Let's not go that far just yet, Beorn muttered as he pulled off his shirt to reveal his greatly muscled and hairy upper body. He rolled his massive shoulders back and stretched his arms a few times before sighing. Much better. What are you doing? Tauriel wondered as her eyes skimmed the half-naked male. I'm going to transform into a bear and carry you two on my back, the shapeshifter explained, cracking his neck. We'll cover more distance that way. Plus, I can keep you both safe at the same time. The elf tapped her lower lip in consideration. You know, I've written many different steeds in my life, but this is the first time I've ever considered writing a bear. Beorn, because he obviously didn't understand boundaries, leered at the elf. Sweetheart, I'll give you a ride anytime. Tauriel threw her head back and laughed. I will take it into consideration, Master Beorn. Oh, for the love of... Really? Do you two have to do this right now? Bilbo demanded, throwing his arms up into the air. Oh, don't be like that, little bunny. I'll give you what I do. Baron reassured, wiggling his fuzzy brows. I will stab you in your sleep, he promised in return with a sweet smile. Kinky, the shapeshifter tossed back before growing serious. Okay, lovies, stand back now and try not to scream. The elf and hobbit each took a few steps back as Beorn's bones began to crack and shift under his skin, moving and growing longer and wider. His skin became thinner as it was stretched as far as it could go, while his thick hair grew even thicker and more abundant. Beorn closed his eyes and gritted his teeth as he changed, but he didn't scream from the obvious pain he was in. Bilbo was both impressed and horrified by it all. Oh, Tariel whispered, her eyes wide as she covered her mouth with one hand. In all my years, I never... He nodded. He had seen Beorn transform before, but it had never ceased to wow him time and time again. He's amazing. Indeed, agreed the elf as her eyes softened and she dropped her hand. Beorn's transformation from a normal-looking man into a bear took only a few minutes, and before long the towering giant was gone. In his place stood a great black bear with thick fur, powerful muscles, and sharp claws. Beorn growled and shook himself once before opening his dark eyes to meet their gaze. Beorn, are you well? The hobbit asked, taking a step forward and raising one hand. The bear snorted and scrubbed at his face with one paw that, even with the claws and teeth, managed to look cute. Tariel chuckled. I'm thinking that's a yes. Well, come along then. I'll help you up. Bilbo followed and allowed the elf to boost him up onto the bear's back in one smooth gesture. Beorn grunted but didn't move as the hobbit made himself comfortable. Beorn's back was so wide that he couldn't sit right, and he found that he needed to dig his fingers into the thick fur just to hold himself up. Tariel easily helped herself up and settled behind him, her longer legs able to straddle the bear more comfortably. She wrapped a secure arm around his waist and pulled him to lean back against her chest. I have you, Master Baggins, she reassured, patting his waist. I won't let you fall. Thank you, he replied dryly as he wrapped more of the thick fur around his fingers. Shall we leave then? Hi, agreed the elf as she tapped her heels against the bear's ribs. Master Beorn, we're ready. Let's go. The Beorn snorted and crouched down before leaping into a sprint that surprised his riders. Bilbo dug his knees into the bear's back and leaned closer to the elf behind him as they finally headed into the Battle of the Five Armies. War was not something Bilbo believed he would ever learn to tolerate. Oh, he could fight when he needed to, and even injure his enemy if he had to, but killing would never feel natural to him. Even when it was at the defense of another or himself, he could not fight the cold weight of guilt that settled in his gut as he watched the light die in someone's eyes. Racing into battle with Beorn and Tariel, he wondered yet again how he was to defeat an army and save his friends, but he couldn't even stomach the thought of killing. As Beorn drew closer and closer to Erebor, the hobbit realized that there were even more goblins and orcs than he had originally thought. The dwarves were holding their own against the horde for the moment, but he could see that it wouldn't last. The elves and men needed to hurry. Do you have a plan? Tariel asked, leaning down slightly to speak in his ear. He nodded. I need to find Thorin and his nephews first. Azog is set on killing them above all others. As you wish, Tariel replied as she pulled out her bow and an arrow. Lean down against Master Beorn so I can get a clear shot. Bilbo quickly dropped to his stomach and locked his knees and elbows as the elf behind him began to pick off orcs and wargs and goblins without pausing. Each draw was swift and smooth and whistled through the air easily. He couldn't even see the target the elf hit, but he was sure each of them was dead the moment her arrow was released. Below them, Beorn released a roar that sounded more like a laugh than a battle cry. Bilbo had a feeling the shapeshifter was enjoying watching Tariel take out their enemy with so much ease. We're getting close to the main horde, Tariel warned, notching back another arrow and standing up on her knees. Prepare yourself, Master Baggins. He nodded and pushed himself up to his knees and reached for Sting. Over Beorn's head, he saw another orc fall to Tariel's arrow, while nearby a goblin was cleaved in two by a dwarf. Everywhere he looked, there were dwarves fighting against orcs and wargs and goblins, but he found that none of them were his dwarves. Beorn released a roar that rumbled through him and made his bones shake in their sockets. A good portion of the orcs and wargs turned to face him at the sound, and he could see them racing to meet the bear and his riders. Behind him, Tariel released another arrow, taking out one of the wargs and causing the orc rider to fall off. Two more followed the same fate, but 5 more orcs and wargs continued to charge them. Get ready to jump!" Tauriel ordered as she slid her bow around her neck and pulled out her sword. Before Bilbo could ask how, the elf stood up and leapt off the bear and onto one of the orc riders. She easily parried its sword with one hand while driving the other to its vulnerable neck as she landed. The warg stumbled in the sudden flux in weight and crashed into the ground, sending its rider tumbling out of the saddle. As the orc fell and gurgled on its own blood, Tauriel easily slid her bloody blade behind her, stabbing the warg in the side of the neck and ending its life with a flick of her wrist. "How am I supposed to stop then?" Bilbo muttered to himself, even as he threw himself off of Beorn's back. He forced himself into an awkward roll when he hit the ground that made his ribs shriek a string of curses at him. When he stopped, he dizzily rose to his feet and looked up just in time to see Beorn maul an orc and warg at the same time. 2 of the 5 riders were dead, but the other 3 were still alive and fighting, with more following in their lead. Tauriel easily took down one with her bow, while Beorn proceeded to smack one of the riders out of its harness with one giant paw. But one of the riders noticed the hobbit and came galloping toward him with a snarl. "Oh, lovely!" he thought before throwing himself to the side to avoid being trampled on. As he pivoted around on one heel, the orc swung back and around and tried to lop his head off with a growing axe. Bilbo ducked and swung his blade out in an arc, catching the warg in the face as it attempted to lunge at him. It snarled and pulled back to crouch down, preparing to leap again, only to fail as an arrow embedded itself in its forehead. The warg collapsed, sending its rider sprawling out of its saddle. Seeing an opening, he sprang forward and drove his sword as hard as possible into the orc's neck. The orc jerked a few times as black blood began to leak everywhere before collapsing to the ground. Bilbo carefully avoided looking into its darkening eyes and worked on pulling his sword loose. It was stuck deep, though, and he had to put one foot on the orc's chest in order to pull Sting free. "Master Baggins!" Tauriel yelled, catching his attention. When he looked up, he found the elf had an orc in a headlock and was using it as a shield against another while burying her sword into the goblin behind her. When she saw that she had his attention, she jerked her head to Beorn, and he turned to look just in time to watch as the bear ripped an orc's throat open with his teeth. "Why would you tell me to watch that?" the hobbit complained, feeling his stomach twist. Tauriel visibly rolled her eyes as she pushed her shield into the orc she was guarding against, and then ran her long sword into both of the orcs. "The elves and men are coming, so get back on Master Beorn's back!" Bilbo sniffed, but still sheathed Sting and jogged back to Beorn. Once he was close enough, the bear crouched down and allowed him to climb onto his back. He winced slightly at the feel of the bloody fur, but still buried his fingers into the clumped strands. Soon he felt Tauriel settle behind him, one arm slipping around him once more, while her other held her sword, poised and ready. "Let's go find your friends," the elf said into his ear. She nudged Beorn, and then they were off. Around them, the battle continued on.